Commander Vextar of the Galactic Coalition Navy had seen many species attempt warfare over his 3 centuries of military service. The crystalline hive with their sonic disruptors, the gas giants with their electromagnetic pulse cannons, the silicon collective with their molecular dissolvers, all of them had possessed weapons that displayed proper technological advancement, proper sophistication, proper everything that separated advanced civilizations from the primitive mudslingers still crawling around on planetary surfaces. So when the sensor readings showed the approaching human vessels, Vextar felt that familiar surge of superior amusement that came with encountering a new species that clearly hadn't gotten the memo about how modern combat worked. "Sir, we're receiving weapons signatures from the human fleet," reported Lieutenant Crixton from his sensor station, his 4 eyes blinking in rapid succession as he processed the data. They appear to be using kinetic projectile systems. The bridge of the Hegemony flagship fell silent for exactly 3 seconds before erupting in what could only be described as polite, military-grade snickering. Even Vextar couldn't suppress the clicking sound that passed for laughter among his species. "Kinetic projectiles," he repeated, savoring each syllable like a fine wine. "You mean they're still throwing things at each other? How delightfully primitive." His weapons officer, Zephyric, leaned over her console with obvious glee. "Sir, I'm reading chemical propellants, metal casings. By the void, they're literally shooting pieces of metal through space. Should I prepare our energy shields? Though honestly, I'm not sure our deflectors can handle something so hilariously outdated." "Oh, please, by all means, prepare the shields," Vextar said, settling back into his command throne with the satisfaction of someone about to watch a particularly entertaining amateur theater production. "We wouldn't want to accidentally hurt their feelings by not taking their adorable little metal pebbles seriously." The human fleet consisted of 12 vessels, each one bristling with what appeared to be, tubes. Lots and lots of tubes. Some small, some large, all of them pointing outward like the quills of some angry space porcupine that had raided a construction site. "Sir, the human flagship is hailing us," announced communications specialist Nixara, her tone carefully neutral despite the twitching around her mouth that suggested she was fighting back her own amusement. "Put them through. I'm curious to hear what sort of threats they plan to make with their antique collection." The view screen shimmered to life, revealing a human female with dark hair pulled back in what Vextar assumed was some sort of military style. She wore a uniform that actually looked reasonably professional, which was more than he'd expected from a species that apparently hadn't learned about energy weapons yet. "I am Captain Miranda Torres of the Earth Defense Fleet," the human said, her voice steady and professional. "You are trespassing in human-claimed territory. Withdraw immediately or face the consequences." Vextar couldn't help but lean forward slightly, genuinely curious now. "Captain Torres, I am Commander Vextar of the Galactic Coalition Navy. I must say, your reputation for, let's call it unconventional warfare has preceded you. Tell me exactly what consequences are you threatening us with? Are you planning to throw rocks at us?" The human's expression didn't change, which was almost disappointing. Vextar had been hoping for some sort of emotional outburst, maybe some primitive chest thumping. "Commander, I suggest you don't underestimate weapons you don't understand," Torres replied calmly. "Oh, but I do understand them," Vextar said, unable to keep the condescension out of his voice. "Your species uses chemical reactions to propel small metal objects through space. It's the same principle that children use with slingshots, just scaled up. Very nostalgic." Behind him, he could hear several bridge crew members making those clicking sounds again. Zephyric was practically vibrating with suppressed laughter. "The fascinating thing," Vextar continued, warming to his theme, "is that your weapons actually push back against the person firing them. We've seen the recordings. Every time one of your soldiers fires their little metal throwers, they get knocked around by the recoil. It's like watching someone try to fight while simultaneously punching themselves. Do your warriors enjoy the challenge of battling both their enemies and their own equipment?" For the first time, something that might have been a smile flickered across Captain Torres's face. Commander, would you be interested in a demonstration? I think it might be educational. Vextar's crest feathers ruffled with amusement. By all means, Captain. Please, show us these fearsome weapons of yours. We could all use a good laugh. What happened next could only be described as the most polite act of warfare Vextar had ever witnessed. The human fleet didn't charge forward with guns blazing, didn't attempt any sort of sneak attack, didn't even bother powering up their laughably primitive weapons systems. Instead, they simply arranged themselves in a neat formation and waited. Sir, the humans are requesting permission to conduct a controlled demonstration of their weapons capabilities. Nixara reported, her voice carefully professional despite the obvious effort it was taking not to burst into laughter. They're asking us to observe from a safe distance while they, and I quote, show us what we're dealing with. Vextar's crest feathers practically stood on end with amusement. How considerate of them. They want to put on a show for us. Very well, let's indulge their little performance. Move us to observation distance and prepare full sensor recording. The Naval Historical Archives will want documentation of this. The Coalition fleet adjusted position, settling into what felt like theater seating for the most bizarre military demonstration in galactic history. Vextar had to admit, there was something almost charming about the humans' confidence in their primitive technology. Sir, the human Captain Torres is requesting a private channel, Nixara announced. Put her through. I'm genuinely curious what sort of sales pitch she's preparing. Captain Torres appeared on screen again, still wearing that same calm, professional expression that was starting to annoy Vextar more than he cared to admit. There was something unsettling about someone remaining so composed while commanding such obviously inferior technology. Commander Vextar, before we begin, I'd like to give you some context, Torres said. Your weapons officer mentioned energy shields, electromagnetic pulse systems, molecular dissolvers. Very impressive technology. Very clean. Thank you, Vextar replied, though he detected something in her tone that made his diplomatic smile feel slightly forced. We pride ourselves on civilized warfare. Precise, efficient, minimal collateral damage. The hallmarks of advanced military science. Absolutely, Torres agreed. Would you mind demonstrating one of your weapons? I think my crew would benefit from seeing proper galactic standard armaments in action. Vextar's eyes lit up. This was even better than he'd hoped. Not only would he get to watch their primitive display, but he'd get to show them how real weapons worked first. Zephyric, prepare the Mark 7 plasma lance. Let's give our new friends a proper education in modern combat techniques. His weapons officer practically glowed with pride as she activated the ship's primary energy weapon. The plasma lance was a thing of beauty, all smooth curves and elegant engineering. No moving parts, no chemical reactions, no crude mechanical systems, just pure, contained stellar fire ready to be unleashed with surgical precision. Observe, Captain Torres, Vextar said, unable to keep the smugness out of his voice. This is what actual military technology looks like. The plasma lance fired with barely a whisper of sound, a brilliant blue-white beam lancing out to strike an asteroid roughly 2 kilometers away. The rock simply ceased to exist. No explosion, no debris field, no dramatic fireworks. One moment there was an asteroid. The next moment there was a small cloud of ionized gas dissipating into space. Notice, Vextar continued, settling back into full lecture mode, the complete absence of recoil, the precision targeting, the clean energy transfer, no waste, no unnecessary violence, no operator discomfort. This is what happens when a species moves beyond throwing things at their problems. Captain Torres nodded thoughtfully. Impressive. Very elegant. Your weapon systems clearly prioritize operator comfort and energy efficiency. Exactly, Vextar exclaimed, pleased that at least one human seemed capable of recognizing superior engineering. A weapon should enhance the warrior, not fight against them. Why would anyone design a system that hurts the user while attacking the enemy? That's a very reasonable perspective, Torres replied. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to show you our approach to the same problem. The human flagship began rotating slowly, bringing what appeared to be a relatively small tube into position. Vextar squinted at the sensor readings, trying to understand what he was looking at. "That's it?" he asked. "That little metal tube is your weapon." "This is Sergeant Jake Morrison," Torres said as a human male appeared in the transmission feed. He was holding what looked like a small, crude metal stick with some sort of trigger mechanism. "Jake, would you mind showing the commander what a standard infantry rifle can do?" Sergeant Morrison grinned, an expression that somehow managed to be both friendly and slightly unsettling. "Happy to, Captain." "Commander Vextar, this is what we call an M27 assault rifle. Standard military issue. Nothing fancy." He shouldered the weapon, aimed at a piece of space debris, and pulled the trigger. What happened next made absolutely no sense from any reasonable engineering perspective. The weapon bucked violently in the sergeant's hands, his entire body jerking backward from the force. A visible muzzle flash erupted from the end of the barrel, and somewhere in the distance, the piece of debris exploded into fragments. "Dead." Vextar stared at the screen in confusion. "Did your weapon just assault your own soldier?" Sergeant Morrison disappeared from view for a moment, then returned carrying what could only be described as the rifle's angry, oversized cousin. This new weapon was shorter, stockier, and somehow managed to look even more primitive than the first one. If the rifle had been a metal stick with delusions of grandeur, this thing looked like a metal stick that had been hitting the gym and harboring violent thoughts. "This," Morrison announced with obvious pride, "is a 12-gauge combat shotgun. She's got a bit more personality than the rifle." Vextar found himself leaning forward despite his better judgment. "More personality? How can an inanimate object have personality?" "Oh, you'll see," Morrison replied, and that grin was back again. The grin that was starting to make Vextar's skin crawl for reasons he couldn't quite identify. Morrison shouldered the weapon, braced himself in a way that suggested he was preparing for some sort of impact, and fired. The result was educational. The weapon didn't just buck backward this time, it practically tried to escape from Morrison's grip entirely. The sergeant's entire upper body jerked violently, his feet sliding backward across the deck plating. The muzzle flash was significantly more dramatic, and the sound that came through the transmission was less like a gunshot and more like a small thunderclap. But what happened to the target was even more concerning. The piece of debris didn't just explode, it disintegrated. One moment there was a chunk of metal roughly the size of a shuttlecraft. The next moment there was a rapidly expanding cloud of metallic fragments spreading in all directions. The bridge of Vextar's flagship had gone very, very quiet. "That," Crixton said slowly, "that was significantly more destructive than the first weapon, and it hit him significantly harder too." Zefric added, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been concern. Why would they design their weapons to become more violent toward the operator as they become more effective? Morrison was checking his weapon again, completely unfazed by what had just happened.
That's the beauty of kinetic energy, folks.
The more force you put behind the projectile, the more force gets transferred back to you. Physics doesn't play favorites. Captain Torres stepped back into view, and Vextar was disturbed to notice that her calm expression now looked less professional and more anticipatory. "Commander, you asked why we would design weapons that hurt the user," she said. "The answer is simple. We don't design them that way. The recoil is just a natural consequence of the laws of physics. Every joule of energy we put into that projectile comes back to us as recoil. We could eliminate it, but that would mean reducing the power of our weapons. So you choose to endure personal discomfort in order to maximize destructive capability." Vextar asked, genuinely trying to understand the logic. "We choose to accept the consequences of power," Torres corrected. "Your plasma weapons are elegant, efficient, clean. They're also limited by the energy you can safely contain and direct. Our weapons are limited only by how much punishment the operator can absorb." Something cold was beginning to form in Vextar's stomach. "How much punishment can your operators absorb?" Morrison's grin widened. "Well, that depends on how big a hole you need to make. Captain, should I show them the anti-material rifle?" "Please do," Torres replied. Vextar was beginning to suspect that he really didn't want to see the anti-material rifle. Morrison vanished again, and this time when he returned he wasn't carrying the weapon so much as wrestling with it. The thing was enormous, easily as long as Morrison was tall, with a barrel that looked like it could double as a piece of construction equipment. It was mounted on some sort of bipod system, and Morrison was clearly struggling with its weight. "Okay," Morrison said, breathing slightly heavily as he set the weapon up. "This is where things get interesting. This is a 50 caliber anti-material rifle. It's designed to punch through armored vehicles, reinforced bunkers, small buildings, basically anything that needs a really big hole in it." "How big a hole?" Zephyr asked, though her voice suggested she was afraid of the answer. "Big enough," Morrison replied. He gestured to something off-screen. "We've set up a series of targets for this one. Steel plates, ceramic armor, composite materials, 3 meters of layered defensive materials, the kind of stuff you'd find protecting critical ship systems." Vextar watched in growing horror as Morrison positioned himself behind the massive weapon. The sergeant braced himself against what appeared to be a reinforced firing position, double-checked his grip and took careful aim. "Now, the thing about physics," Morrison said conversationally, "is that it's completely fair. Whatever energy this rifle puts into the projectile, it's going to put exactly the same amount of energy into me. The difference is the projectile is small and light, so it gets accelerated to incredible speeds. I'm big and heavy, so I just get knocked around a bit." "A bit?" Vextar repeated weakly. Morrison fired. The recoil was devastating. The weapon bucked so violently that it lifted Morrison completely off his feet, slamming him backward into the reinforced barrier behind him. The muzzle blast was like a small explosion, and the sound that came through the transmission made several of Vextar's bridge crew cover their auditory organs. But what happened to the target array was beyond devastating. The projectile didn't just punch through the layered defensive materials, it went through them like they weren't even there. Steel, ceramic, composite, all of it simply parted before the incoming round like paper before a knife. The projectile continued on through empty space for several more kilometers before finally striking an asteroid and boring a perfectly round hole completely through it. 3 meters of military-grade armor, Morrison said cheerfully as he picked himself up off the deck, and it didn't even slow down. Vextar stared at the sensor readings, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. That projectile maintained its velocity after penetrating 3 meters of defensive plating. "Physics is funny that way," Torres replied. "A small object moving fast enough carries incredible amounts of kinetic energy. And the beautiful thing about kinetic energy is that it doesn't care about your shields, your deflectors, or your energy-dampening fields. Mass times velocity squared, divided by 2. It's the most honest equation in the universe. But your soldier," Crixton said, his voice barely above a whisper, "he absorbed the same amount of energy that just went through 3 meters of armor. What Morrison brought out next couldn't reasonably be called a personal weapon anymore. It was more like a piece of artillery that someone had optimistically decided might be portable if you had very low standards for what constituted portable. The launcher was nearly as tall as Morrison himself, with a bore wide enough to stick your fist into and a design philosophy that seemed to prioritize maximum destruction over minor concerns like operator survival. "This," Morrison announced with the enthusiasm of someone about to demonstrate their favorite hobby, "is a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. RPG for short. It fires a self-contained explosive projectile at high velocity toward whatever needs to stop existing." Vextar found his voice, though it came out somewhat higher pitched than he would have preferred. "Self-contained explosive? You mean your projectiles explode after they hit?" "Well, yes," Morrison replied, as if this was the most obvious thing in the universe. "Kinetic energy is great for penetration, but sometimes you need a bit more. Area effect. And the recoil?" Zephyr asked, though she sounded like she really didn't want to know the answer. Morrison's grin took on an almost manic quality. "That's where things get fun." He hefted the launcher onto his shoulder, and Vextar could see him brace against what appeared to be a heavily reinforced firing position. Whatever was about to happen, the humans had clearly prepared for it to be violent. Now, the thing about rocket launchers, Morrison said, conversationally, is that they're basically controlled explosions pointed in a specific direction. Most of the energy goes forward with the projectile, but some of it comes backward as exhaust, and that exhaust is very, very hot. How hot? Crixton whispered. Hot enough to melt most metals, Morrison replied cheerfully. That's why I'm wearing this heat-resistant suit, and why everyone else is behind blast shields. Safety first. He pulled the trigger. What happened next redefined Vextar's understanding of the word recoil. The launcher didn't just kick backward, it erupted. A massive gout of superheated exhaust exploded from the rear of the weapon, washing over Morrison in a wave of fire and fury. The recoil slammed him backward so hard that even with the reinforced firing position, he slid several meters across the deck. But the projectile was something else entirely. It streaked across space, trailing fire struck the target asteroid, and detonated with enough force to crack the entire rock formation. Chunks of stone the size of shuttlecraft went spinning off in all directions, and when the debris cloud cleared, there was simply less asteroid than there had been before. Morrison stood up, wisps of smoke rising from his heat-resistant suit, and gave a cheerful thumbs up to the camera. Did he just... Nixara started to say, then stopped, apparently unable to finish the sentence. Did he just set himself on fire to destroy a target? Vextar completed, his voice barely above a whisper. Standard operating procedure, Captain Torres replied matter-of-factly. The backblast from rocket launchers is a known hazard. We train for it, we prepare for it, and we accept it as part of the cost of doing business. The cost of doing business, Vextar repeated slowly. You're willing to burn your own soldiers to achieve tactical objectives. We're willing to accept that effective weapons have consequences, Torres corrected. Your energy weapons eliminate the consequences for the operator by limiting the power you can safely deploy. Our philosophy is different. We believe that if you're not willing to pay the price for victory, you probably don't deserve it. Something was clicking into place in Vextar's mind, a terrible understanding that he really wished wasn't happening. The correlation between recoil and destructive power isn't accidental, it's fundamental. Newton's third law, Morrison said, still grinning despite having been recently on fire. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. The more energy we put into the target, the more energy we have to absorb ourselves. It's not a design flaw, it's physics. And you've built your entire military philosophy around accepting that punishment, Zephyric said, her voice filled with something approaching awe. Not accepting it, Torres corrected again. Embracing it. A weapon that hurts to use is a weapon that demands respect, training, and commitment. It ensures that every shot is deliberate, every engagement is serious. When using your weapon causes you pain, you learn to make every shot count. Vextar was staring at the sensor readings from the destroyed asteroid, trying to calculate the energy involved. Your soldier just absorbed enough kinetic and thermal energy to kill most species we've encountered. Sergeant Morrison is tough, Torres replied. All our soldiers are. We have to be. Our weapons demand it. This is insane, Crixton said quietly. You've weaponized self-harm. Morrison laughed, a sound that was becoming increasingly disturbing to Vextar's ears. Self-harm? Sir, this isn't self-harm. This is investment. Every bruise, every burn, every moment of pain teaches us something about the weapon, about the target, about ourselves. Your energy weapons don't teach you anything except how to point and click. But the inefficiencies, Zephyric protested. The wasted energy, the operator trauma, the medical costs. What medical costs? Morrison asked, genuinely confused. This is what human soldiers are designed for. We heal fast, we adapt quickly, and we get tougher with experience. Every time I fire this launcher, I get a little better at handling the recoil, a little more resistant to the heat, a little more accurate with the targeting. Your soldiers push buttons. Our soldiers become part of the weapon system. The bridge of Vextar's flagship had gone completely silent. Even the usual background hum of the ship's systems seemed muted, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Captain Torres, Vextar said slowly, exactly how powerful can your weapons become? For the first time in the entire demonstration, Torres's calm, professional mask slipped slightly, revealing something underneath that made Vextar's blood run cold. Well, Commander, she said, that depends on how much punishment we're willing to take. And speaking of which, I think it's time you met Chief Engineer Zara Chen and our planetary defense cannon. The cold feeling in Vextar's stomach had now reached his heart. Planetary defense cannon, he whispered. The kind of weapon that can crack moons, Torres replied. The kind of weapon where the recoil is measured in seismic readings. The kind of weapon that proves just how much pain humans are willing to endure for the right to say problem solved. Chief Engineer Zara Chen appeared on the transmission, and Vextar immediately noticed that she wasn't on a ship. The background behind her showed what appeared to be a reinforced bunker built into the surface of an asteroid, with massive support structures and warning signs in at least 6 different human languages. Most concerning of all, she was wearing what looked like full environmental protection gear. Commander Vextar, Chen said, her voice slightly muffled by her helmet's communication system. I understand you've been getting acquainted with our small arms. I thought you might be interested in seeing what we use when small arms aren't quite enough. Small arms? Vextar repeated weakly. You consider rocket launchers to be small arms? Well, yes, Chen replied, as if this was perfectly reasonable. Anything one person can carry and operate is considered small arms. What I'm about to show you requires a dedicated firing platform, a specialized crew, and some very careful calculations about blast radius and structural integrity. Through the view screen, Vextar could see Chen walking deeper into the bunker complex, past warning signs that featured skulls, radiation symbols, and what appeared to be pictographs of people being thrown through the air by explosions. The weapon you're about to see, Chen continued, is classified as a planetary defense cannon. It's designed to engage targets in high orbit, destroy incoming asteroid threats, or remove large geographical features that are deemed inconvenient. Remove geographical features? Crixton squeaked. Mountains mostly, Chen replied conversationally. Sometimes islands. There was one memorable incident involving a small moon, but that was technically an accident. They emerged into a vast chamber carved out of solid rock, and Vextar's sensor readings immediately began screaming warnings about massive energy buildups and structural stress patterns. In the center of the chamber sat something that could only be described as the logical conclusion of human weapon design philosophy taken to its absolute extreme. The cannon was enormous, easily 100 meters long, with a bore wide enough to walk through comfortably. It was mounted on a base that seemed to extend deep into the asteroid's core, connected to what appeared to be an entire power plant's worth of support systems. Most disturbing of all, the entire chamber was lined with shock absorbers, blast dampeners, and what looked like emergency medical stations. This, Chen announced with obvious pride, is Big Bertha. She fires a depleted uranium projectile weighing approximately 50 tons at roughly 10% of light speed. The bridge of Vextar's flagship was so quiet that you could have heard a pin drop in hard vacuum. 10% of light speed, Vextar whispered. Give or take, Chen replied. The exact velocity depends on atmospheric conditions, gravitational effects, and how much coffee the targeting crew has had. But yes, when Bertha fires, the projectile achieves relativistic speeds. And the recoil? Zephyric asked, though she sounded like she was afraid of the answer. Chen's grin was visible even through her helmet faceplate. That's where things get interesting. See, when you fire a 50-ton projectile at 10% of light speed, Newton's third law becomes significant. She gestured to the massive shock absorption system surrounding the cannon. The recoil from Big Bertha generates approximately 8.7 on the Richter scale. That's enough seismic activity to level a small city. That's why we built her inside an asteroid, with the entire structure designed to absorb and distribute the kinetic feedback. You built an earthquake generator, Nixera said faintly. We built a problem solver, Chen corrected. The earthquake is just how physics bills us for the service. Through the chamber's viewports, Vexter could see the target for this demonstration, a dead planet, lifeless and barren, floating in space about 50,000 kilometers away. That planet, Chen said, following his gaze, is roughly the size of your homeworld, Commander. Solid rock, iron core, about as durable as planets get. We're going to put a hole through it. Through it? Vextar's voice cracked slightly. Completely through it, Chen confirmed. Entry hole, exit hole, probably a few secondary fractures from the shock wave. Think of it as the ultimate demonstration of kinetic energy transfer. The targeting systems came online with a sound like a dozen thunderstorms starting simultaneously. The entire asteroid began to vibrate as massive capacitors charged and the cannon's magnetic acceleration systems powered up. All personnel to blast positions, Chen announced over the facility's communication system. Big Bertha is going hot in 60 seconds. She looked directly at the camera. Commander, you might want to move your fleet to a safe distance. The electromagnetic pulse from this shot tends to interfere with sensitive electronics. How far is a safe distance? Vextar asked. About 3-star systems, Chen replied cheerfully. The countdown began, and Vextar watched in horrified fascination as the most powerful weapon he'd ever seen prepared to fire. The humans were about to demonstrate that they were willing to create localized earthquakes, electromagnetic pulses, and relativistic projectiles, all for the privilege of putting a hole through a planet. At 0, Big Bertha fired. The recoil was visible from space. The entire asteroid shuddered, cracked, and shifted position from the sheer kinetic feedback. The electromagnetic pulse washed over the Coalition fleet like a wave, temporarily disrupting their sensors and communications. And the planet. The planet now had a perfectly round hole punched completely through it, from North Pole to South Pole. The Coalition fleet retreated. Not fled, not withdrew, not conducted a tactical repositioning. Retreated. For the first time in Vextar's 3-century military career, he ordered a full retreat from an enemy that hadn't even fired a shot at them. As the human fleet grew smaller in the rear view screen, Vextar sat in his command chair and tried to process what he'd just witnessed. His bridge crew was unusually quiet, all of them dealing with their own versions of the same fundamental recalibration of reality. Sir, Crixton said, eventually, his voice carefully neutral, should I file a standard first contact report? Vextar considered this question for a long moment. How exactly did one file a report that essentially said, we encountered a species that has weaponized self-harm and can punch holes through planets for fun? No, he said finally. This requires a special classification. Priority Alpha, direct to High Command, maximum security clearance. What classification designation should I use? Crixton asked. Vextar thought about Captain Torres's predatory smile, about Sergeant Morrison laughing while on fire, about Chief Engineer Chen casually creating earthquakes to solve problems. Extremely dangerous. Do not engage without overwhelming superiority. Recommend immediate diplomatic contact. Sir, Zefric said quietly. I've been analyzing the tactical implications of what we just saw. Their weapons philosophy changes everything. Every assumption we've made about combat effectiveness, about acceptable casualty rates, about the relationship between technology and military capability. It's all wrong. Vextar nodded slowly. They've solved the fundamental problem of advanced warfare. We build weapons that protect the operator at the cost of limited power. They build weapons that sacrifice the operator for unlimited power. And they've created soldiers tough enough to survive the sacrifice. It's not just the weapons, Nixara added. It's the mindset. They don't see recoil as a design flaw to be eliminated. They see it as a training tool, a character builder, a way to ensure that only the strongest and most committed can use their most powerful weapons. Pain as a feature, not a bug, Crixton murmured. And the scariest part, Vextar said, staring at the starfield ahead of them, is that it works. They can put holes through planets because they're willing to create earthquakes. They can fire relativistic projectiles because they're willing to absorb relativistic recoil. There's no upper limit to their weapons development except their own physical durability. And they keep getting more durable, Zefric pointed out. Every generation of soldiers is tougher than the last because they're constantly pushing their limits. Vextar closed his eyes and tried to imagine what human weapons technology might look like in another century, when they'd had time to really think about the possibilities. The thought made him physically ill. "Set course for home," he ordered. "Maximum speed. And send a message to High Command. We need to start peace negotiations with Earth immediately. Whatever they want, whatever it costs, we give it to them." "Sir?" Crixton asked, confused. "Because," Vextar said, opening his eyes and looking at the stars that suddenly seemed much less friendly than they had this morning, "I never want to find out what happens when humans decide that recoil measured in star system displacement is an acceptable trade-off for solving really big problems." The bridge fell silent again, and the Coalition flagship fled toward home, carrying news that would change galactic politics forever. Humanity had arrived, and they brought weapons that hurt them just as much as they hurt their enemies, which, as it turned out, made them the most terrifying force in the galaxy.